Okay, so it was not recording. I'm not going to start over, but so we're going to start with, okay, so for those joining us on the recording, I said a bunch of announcements and gave a summary of this module that I'm not going to repeat. So let's start with, okay, so where was I? Yeah, so we're, the first module here that I'm going to talk about is, or this first submodule, the first part of what I'm going to talk about today is discrimination in online advertising. And so this is based on 4 papers, this part. So the first paper is Discrimination in Online Advertising, a Multidisciplinary Inquiry. Anupam Dutta was kind enough to send me his slides, but I suspect the first author actually made them, but I'm not sure about that. And then there's 2 papers out of this superstar group that has been studying discrimination on Facebook and ad discrimination on Facebook. And so their first paper is Discrimination Through Optimization, How Facebook's Ad Delivery Can Lead to Skewed Outcomes. The title very much gives away the punchline. And then the second paper that they have here, they have I think 3 or 4 in this line of work, is also on Facebook, ad delivery algorithms, the hidden arbiters of political messaging. So it focused specifically on the political implications and like sort of ad targeting and political discrimination. And here, Muhammad Ali and Alexander Korolova were kind enough to send me their slides, so you'll see their names on them. And then the last paper I'm going to talk about is looking at also Facebook, but a bunch of STEM ads across, I think, 191 countries on Facebook, and called Algorithmic Bias, an empirical study of apparent gender-based discrimination in the display of STEM career ads. Okay, so let's just start with where I guess the literature started, which is just an empirical documentation that discrimination is in advertising exists on these online platforms, which might not be surprising. And so this is from that first paper, where they cited another paper that found this. And so this first paper looked at advertising by a group called the Barrett Group, and saw that in the past they'd done an employment-related ad. This is on Google, like Google AdWords or something, and they were and this is like a high-end search, like sort of searches for executives of companies with high compensation, and so they were looking at these type of jobs that were like pay over 200K, and they saw empirically that like of the people whose gender they know who received the ad, 402 were male and 60 were female. And the impressions were similarly skewed. And then the question is, of course, the first one is this illegal, right? Yes, sorry. So this number, these first 2 numbers, 402 and 60, is the unique individuals who saw this ad. Impressions is just like the total number of times this ad was seen. And so often in advertising, like y'all might have noticed this on Facebook and Google and other places, is you'll see the same ad multiple times. And so those are called impressions. Any other questions? Okay, so the first question, of course, is this illegal, right? We have blatant sort of differential in in who saw an ad for a very lucrative type of employment. And then the second question is like, why does this happen? And then, of course, implicit in this is like, how can we stop this? And so there's a lot of work on discrimination, of course, in the law that I'm not going to be able to summarize well. And I think this paper does a good job if like you're actually interested in the legal aspects. Like I would suggest just reading the paper. But they sort of, as their starting point, they just point out that the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, going back to the 1960s, does outlaw discrimination in advertising, right? So it is unlawful to print or publish or cause to be printed or published any advertising relating to employment and other things, indicating any preference, including based on sex, right? So on the face of it, this seems potentially violating this law. And, of course, like the reason this was needed was you would see a lot of, like historically, you would see a lot of ads like this that would, this is asking for a CPA for a small SF financial firm, and they only wanted men, right? So like discrimination in advertising has like a huge history in the United States, and the Civil Rights Act was trying to counter it. And I don't want to actually get into sort of the legal aspects of whether this specific thing is illegal, but what I do think is instructive to even begin answering that question, and sort of also for those of you in like more like technical careers, sort of trying to understand like what kinds of discrimination might be going on in your platforms, is trying to understand all the different ways that like this just, we just have this like, this disparate impact of how many males saw the ad and how many females saw the ad. And sorry, my sort of like much of data science, my language today is like often going to be switching between like sex terms and gender terms at the binary. That's because sort of this is what, at least at the time, that like the default options Google gave. I'll try to avoid that as much as possible. Okay, yeah, so so you have just like an apparent difference, and let's try to understand how that difference could have come about, right? So the first one is, and so the way to do that, and I really like this slide or this set of slides that Anupam sent me, is just trying to understand what are all the different players in the advertising space and how could have actions by each of them cause this difference to happen. And so the first one, of course, maybe the most blatant, is that this advertiser was telling Google, only show my ad to males, right? And at least historically, there was nothing technically stopping the advertiser from doing this. And so just to validate this, what they did in this paper is they just literally just went to Google. And so this is a part of a screen that an advertiser sees when they want to advertise on Google, like who they want to target. And the authors of this paper just went to Google, said they want to target different ads to different genders. And you can also do age and parental status and a whole bunch of other things. And then they tried to advertise two separate types of jobs. One type of job they only targeted males. The other type of job they only targeted to females. And and Google, followed their bidding. Google did in fact just serve one ad to males and the other type of ad to females, right? So at least at the time, there was nothing technically preventing an advertiser to go in and like blatantly only show ads to one gender or the other, to one sex or the other. And this, in some sense, is directly illegal behavior by the advertiser. Directly violates the Civil Rights Act, but there was nothing technically blocking them from doing it. It's of course unclear to like how much this was actually going on compared to the other avenues that discrimination could arise. And maybe far more recently, or like later in the process than you might expect, Google has in reaction to papers like this has somewhat limited targeting options that would be in violation of the laws, at least in the US. So this is a blog post from October of 2020, so just about a year ago. They now for housing, employment, and credit products, they no longer allow you to directly target audiences based on gender, age, parental status, marital status, or zip code. And I think they hadn't already been allowing it by race. And so now they also expanded that, right? Because like zip code, for example, in the United States is often a very good proxy for race. And then they give a bunch of examples for how this happens. Okay, so is discrimination solved on Google if I just do this? Right, are we done? If we were done, then I don't know what we'd be doing the remaining 45 minutes or 55 minutes of class. So unfortunately, we're not. And that's because discrimination has a bunch of other causes on online advertising. That's a good question. So the question is like, I've never told Google my marital status. How can they even have that as targeted advertising if technically they don't know directly from me? And I think that's the other thing that I'm going to touch on a little bit today, but I think this is like a whole nother topic that deserves its own justice. Is there's a lot of, well, one, Google can sort of guess at your marital status, and they can use proxies for it, and they can do all sorts of things that they can fill this in even if you don't explicitly tell them. For example, they can go out and buy public records or buy credit card data or private records and then just fill this in if they wanted to. Or they could just use your behavior, your search history to guess at it. But I think the other sort of more interesting thing is that, so for example, Facebook has historically not allowed direct targeting by race, right? So directly saying, I want to only target Asian Americans or whatever. But what they have done is they allow targeting affinity groups or something. So they allow targeting people who have historically shown an interest in Asian American culture, or people who have historically shown an interest in Black culture in the United States, or people who speak Spanish and have shown an interest in that culture, right? So they've designed these sort of proxies of people who've shown an interest in that often correlate with race very, very well, but allows them to wash their hands of oh, we're not allowing targeting by race. Any other questions? Okay. So, okay, so we have the first avenue that this disparate impact could have happened, which is just maybe the advertiser was just sexist. We don't know if that was the cause in this case, but nothing was technically preventing them from doing it. But there's a bunch of other causes too. And so the second one is they label as behavior of others. But as I'm going to get into, it's not clear that sort of in what path this behavior of others goes through. So maybe the other thing that happened was the advertiser didn't express a preference. The advertiser was I want everyone to have the same shot at seeing or at least men and women to have the same sort of, I'm not limiting to one or the other. But then so Google started showing the ad, and it just found that men happened to click through to the ad more than women did, right? And all of these advertising systems are optimized to maximize, or some depending on the objective the advertiser sets and the payment model and so on. But to first order, a lot of these systems are set to optimize the click-through rate. That it's not a pure like auction that Google is running on these advertisements. Google also cares about showing relevant ads to people. And so they're going to make it easier and cheaper to show an ad to someone if they think that they're more likely to click on it. And so maybe something that happened is Google started showing the ads, and like, maybe the first 10 minutes it was or like the first day or whatever, it was showing the ad equally. But then it just happened that more male users were clicking on the ad than female users. And so over time, Google learned that that this feature that I'm calling male is more likely to click on the ad. My click-through rate predictions are higher, and so so it should be cheaper to show this ad to males than females, and so it shows it ad more to them than the other. So that's perfectly viable as an avenue, and in some sense, maybe, certainly the advertiser would be happy if, not happy, but would be able to wash their hands of legal liability potentially if this was the cause. And maybe even Google would, right? Maybe even Google would be able to say, and this is why the law here is really murky, and I don't even want to touch this in this class. Go talk to James Grimmelman if you care. He's the one law professor here on campus. And this is why it's murky, is potentially Google would be able to wash their hands as well and say, look, I have a neutral system that's set to optimize click-through rates. It's not my fault that males were just more likely to click on this ad than females. And so, like, yes, that's what happened, but it's not my fault, it's the user's fault. But there's another thing that also could have happened, and this is actually related to the next set of papers I'm going to talk about that are actually on Facebook, which is it could have been that before any users started even clicking on the ads, Google took the text of the ad and maybe like if there's an image to the ad, depending on if it's a banner ad or search, like a search ad or all the the side ads or so on. And it could have happened that Google ran the text and the image through some deep learning thing, and it predicted that men would be more likely to click on the ad. And so from the very beginning, from day 0, it used its predictions of click-through rates and made it cheaper to show the ad to them. Right? So that could have happened. And that would be potentially harder for Google to wash its hands of. Right? So that's not even behavior on this particular ad, that's like behavior that their own neural network model has shown. And so the question is like those two things are, certainly, or potentially not the advertiser's fault. It could still be their responsibility, but it's not their fault. But these two things have different levels of fault for Google, right? Like one in some sense might be legally far worse for them, but also, ethically or sort of for whatever reason, I think it's important to distinguish between those two cases. And a large part of the literature has been trying to distinguish between those two cases, and it turns out to be a hard thing to do. These authors found a way to do it, and I think I'll get to the actual way that they did it in a little bit, but it's like very technically clever. Okay, so now I'm going to start talking about this paper, Discrimination Through Optimization, how Facebook's ad delivery can lead to skewed outcomes. And it's just, now it's, the exact same, Facebook and Google are very similar advertising networks in some sense. Of course, also very different in what they know about users and so on. But so now let's just substitute Facebook for Google from what I've been saying. And what so they were interested in documenting, okay, so the previous thing documented ad discrimination on Google. So does the same thing happen on Facebook? And so what they did was, and they were particularly interested in trying to understand Facebook's role in this, as opposed to just like, as an advertiser allowed to just like target men or women or whatever. And so what they did was they set up an advertiser account, And then they set up two ads that, except for the content of the ad, had the exact same parameters. So, so they did identical targeting. So they told Facebook for both of these ads, like, I generically want to advertise. They didn't do any separate things. The only differences in the ads were the content. And they found this stereotypically sort of male ad was delivered to 85% men. And the stereotypically sort of, the fashion and makeup ad was delivered to only 5% men. So clearly Facebook is doing something, or something is happening, either with click-through rates or something else that Facebook is doing that goes beyond the targeting parameters. And so what they wanted to understand was, like, why is this happening, right? Like, what causes this disparity and who's seeing the ad? And so the first thing that they did, as you might expect, is they tried to vary the ad itself. So they said, okay, so an advertisement has a bunch of things. The advertisement has like the text of the ad at the top. It has an image. It has a URL that it goes to, and it has the headline of the URL. And so they just varied all of these things. They hid some of these things, they showed others. And they found that basically the images were causing all the disparities. That if you didn't have the image, but you still had the headline, the other text, sort of the stuff at the top, there were like a few differences, but not a huge difference in the two ads for the fraction of men in the audience. But as soon as you added the image, like suddenly Facebook was showing like 85%, like, one ad was showing 85% to men, the other ad only 5%. So clearly something is going on with the images. And then they wanted to understand, okay, so we think it's the images. Is it the images because of click-through rates? Is it because, on the first day, the ad is being shown evenly, but then like after that, like only men are clicking on the ad because of the image, and vice versa? And is that's what's causing the disparities? Okay, so at least a naive check suggests that that's not true. So on the ad, so what this is showing is over time of their advertisement. So this advertisement ran for at least a day. And this is showing the fraction of the audience in each ad that was men. And so like maybe there was some, like maybe Facebook just learned very, very quickly, but like sort of breaking it down on the, like by time, sort of there's no differences between like hour 1 and hour 24. Right? So if it was because like actual click-through rates, it would be like Facebook would have learned very, very quickly, faster than like you can even like detect in the data. Right? So like maybe they learned with the first 10 users, and then but like they were washed out in the averaging. Okay, so where are we so far? So far we have that you have images causing disparities, and there's some evidence. I would say this is fairly strong, but potentially Facebook can argue back and saying, this is not perfect in telling us that it wasn't the users just having differential click-through rate versus Facebook from the beginning just like showing, like interpreting the ad and so on. That's a great question. Those are always the questions you should be asking, because there's always like different targets. Okay, so the question was, but what do I mean by audience? Was it who clicked on it or who it was shown to? And so that's always a question you should be asking, and that the objective sort of in like the parameters you can set for like different types of advertising is like you want to maximize the number of impressions, or you want to maximize the number of clicks, or so on. Because like someone like Coca-Cola wants to do impressions, they don't care if you like click and buy online, whereas like an online retailer wants clicks. in this setting, I'm pretty sure it was audience. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm like 90% sure. I have to go back to the paper, but I'm pretty sure it was impressions. Yeah. Okay. So the skew in delivery is observable from the very beginning and stays constant. And so this provides some evidence that like Facebook's doing something even before any user saw it, right? Facebook is looking at the content of the ad and deciding who should see the ad, even though the advertiser is saying, no, I don't have a preference. Okay, but this is still not maybe perfect evidence. And you might be asking, Nikhil, this looks fairly convincing. Like, what type of stronger evidence could you even ask for? And I think sort of the next thing that they did was like extremely like when I first heard Alexander talk about it, I was just like blown away on how clever this was. So they took so where are we so far? So before I describe what they did, let's just summarize in their words what we've learned so far. So they've so far I've shown you from this paper that it's mostly the image that seems to drive disparities on Facebook, at least at the time. And at least partially, this is not because of click-through rates during like the campaign itself, but by something that Facebook decided beforehand. And so the question is like, what does this thing look like that Facebook is potentially deciding either beforehand or in like the very first few minutes of the ad? And sort of the idea that they went for, which is if you want to answer this question of like what is causing this even before the ad is launched, design something that makes the ad look the same for humans, but different for like a neural network that's processing the ad. And so how do you do that? Many of you might know, but let's just, sort of make it explicit. So you have an image here, and sort of course, like each pixel in this image is represented by numbers. And you, of course, might be familiar with, like 3 of the numbers that a pixel is represented by is the red content, the green content, and the blue content, so RGB. But often there's a 4th, which is the alpha, which is how bright the image is, or sort of like how washed out or how bright. I don't know. I actually don't know exactly what alpha refers to, but it's something along those lines, like how bright the image is. And so this is an image where everything is set, there's different RGB values for these different colors, but everything is at full alpha. This is something where everything is at half alpha, so 128. And this is something where alpha is essentially 0. But they kept the RGB values, right? So the RGB values are the same as they were before, but the alphas are now essentially 0. And so what's sort of the purpose of this is when this gets visualized on a computer screen, humans are just gonna because of the alpha, this is gonna get visualized as essentially white. So anyone seeing the ad is not actually going to be able to see the image. For anyone, looking at just looking at the text of the ad, so like, or if I see the advertisement, I'll see the headline, I'll see sort of the URL, and I'll see like sort of the base text at the top, but I won't see the image. I'll just see white for the image. And from the earlier study, they found that, without the images, there really shouldn't be any disparities. And what they found was there was essentially no difference in these visible or invisible ads. That even whiting out the image led to sort of I think these are slightly different ads. So led to like 60% of like the stereotypically male ad to be shown to males, and then 40% of the stereotypically female ads to be shown to females. And it made no difference in the skew whether or not the image was visible. Ye- Yeah, no, that's a good question, right? So like the question is like earlier we sort of the sort of in that first set of studies, they found that, you know, sort of if you don't have the image, you just have the other stuff, that there like isn't really disparities. Disparities come from the images. And now you're asking that, you know, a white image is actually different than like no image at all, because maybe a white image captures sort of your attention, and then you like move your attention to like the headline, and then like that induces the disparities. Yeah, that could be an avenue, but sort of the um, sort of that would have to be as strong as the like the image itself disparity, right? Because sort of they found that there was like literally like no difference between the visible and invisible images. And so what is this suggesting? This suggests that Facebook actually does have a neural net before the ad is even shown to anyone that says, you know, this ad is only going to appeal to men. Let's only show men this ad. Or this ad is going to appeal to women. Let's only show women this ad. And sort of you might, of course, expect that the obvious follow-up to this paper is, okay, what other domains does this apply to? They found that this was like bodybuilding and fashion or makeup, but like, does this also apply to like other domains that might, and so, yeah, so they found out that a follow-up paper that, yes, this also applies for political advertising. And so what they ran was they ran Sanders and Trump ads. I believe this is 2016, maybe the 20, I believe it was the 2016 election. It might be the 2020 election. Um, but they just ran Sanders ads and Trump ads. And they basically found that even if they have identical targeting, even if for the Sanders ads, you're trying to target conservative voters or vice versa, it was extremely expensive to have a Sanders image or something that would appeal to like the Sanders demographic. And it was really expensive to show that ad to conservatives, or really hard to show that ad to conservatives, or vice versa, right? And so like this is like shocking and troubling in that now you have whatever's Facebook neural net making it really hard, like even with identical targeting parameters, deciding like essentially how expensive it is to reach different types of voters. And it's differentially expensive for different campaigns. And then they have follow-ups that like also do this for jobs and housing and like other things. I think. I believe housing, I've seen that one. I'm not sure if there's a jobs one. Any questions here? Okay. And so these are their conclusions from the political paper. Is yeah, so Facebook is sort of putting its thumb on the scale on who sees which ads, and they sort of characterize this as echo chamber like. And what they also found in the paper that I won't talk about too much is like detailed micro targeting helped a little bit. So like, so Facebook also allows you to like, this was a big part of my summer or working with this and other things last summer, was like Facebook also allows you to like upload like specific targets, like either names or their mobile ad IDs of like specific people that you might want to target, or just like very, very precise micro targeting. And they found that that micro targeting helps a little bit in countering this effect. So like if a Sanders, like if you have a Sanders ad, but you like literally give the names, or like not, they didn't actually give names. I forget what they did. They bought the North Carolina voter file, and I forget the exact thing that they did, but they tried to micro target sort of like one type of group, and they found that somewhat countered this effect, not totally. And so what they concluded was if Facebook were to disable that, which some people are asking for, that actually gives Facebook even more control, right? Because now campaigns have basically no control over who's seeing the ad, and it's basically whatever Facebook believes the audience that'll like your ad, that's who's being shown, right? So like disabling micro-targeting doesn't mean that the ad gets shown like equally to everyone. It just means that Facebook is deciding who it gets shown to. And then the last one is they spent a lot of time in sort of an effort to do this. This is a lot of money, and they had to do all of this outside of Facebook. From what I hear, Facebook was not very happy with them for for doing these set of papers, and like that has real that's like kind of funny, but also like that has real job implications, funding implications, right? A lot of these companies are very powerful even in tech academia. And so this sort of work does have real consequences for the people doing it. Okay, so far where we're at is, okay, maybe the advertiser, okay, so go back to the example at the beginning. Maybe the advertiser was doing targeting and just show my ad to males. And that was, at least at the time, possible. Maybe it was Google or Facebook either like looking at click-through rates and then optimizing, or optimizing just from the ad itself. But is that the universe of causes of the discrimination? There's one more that I want to talk about in online advertising, which is that it could be that this single advertiser is doing nothing wrong, and even Google is doing nothing, right? Google is literally like not doing any optimizations about click-through rates. Google is just like running a marketplace and letting ads show up to whoever they want. Another hypothesis is that it's not this advertiser's fault, but it's the fault of other advertisers who just happen to be winning the auctions to be showing to show the ad to females then. And so this advertiser is losing all the auction. Okay, so step back. The way roughly these, I know I haven't talked about in this class, the way roughly these ad markets work is that they're auctions. Is you show up on the website, and very quickly Google is running an auction where it tells a bunch of advertisers, here's the person who showed up. How much will you pay to show your ad to this person on their screen? And then this auction very quickly runs instantaneously, and then the winner gets the ad shown on your browser. And all of this happens in between the time that you do the search and the results show up. And okay, so with that quick intro, it could be happening that Google isn't putting its thumb on the scales for one advertiser or the other through its click-through rates. And maybe all of the or maybe this advertiser is saying, I want to equally advertise to everyone. But it could be other advertisers who, for legitimate or illegitimate reasons, are willing to spend more money on females. And if that's what's going on, then this advertiser is going to lose all of their auctions for females and win all of their auctions for males. And it turns out that there's at least some evidence that that's happening. So this paper, Algorithmic Bias, an empirical study of apparent gender-based discrimination in the display of STEM career ads, sort of studied STEM career ads on Facebook in 191 countries. And they documented that indeed across countries, men were more likely to see the ads than women. And this was even though, I think I quoted this from the paper, is even though women were more likely to click on the ad conditional on seeing it, right? So even though click-through rates for the people who saw the ad were higher for women, Facebook was still showing it to men more. And they did a bunch of analysis on various causes. And what they concluded was that it actually was competitive spillovers, that it was because sort of in general across most of these countries, women are more sought after for ads by retailers. So retailers are willing to spend more to have their ad show up on Facebook for women than men. And then they sort of also acquired data from a retailer, and they found that that was happening. And because of that, they're more expensive to target, right? You need to spend more money to win an ad auction. And because of that, if sort of I have an algorithm that is neutrally just like, and this is also how they work, is often an advertiser isn't like coding up their like auction strategy. It's like the advertiser is just telling Facebook, I want, these are the types of people I want to show the ads to. Here's how much money I have. Make sure my ad shows up to as many people as possible or gets as many clicks as possible while spending the least amount of, or like spending at most my budget. And then Facebook is doing some optimization for them to like maximize clicks under the budget. And if you do that type of optimization, then you'll show the ads to the people that it's cheapest to show the ad to. And so sort of the STEM ad won't win the auctions for women because they're just more expensive auctions to run. Okay. Any questions on these various causes? Okay. Yeah, so there's, at this point, I think talked about like 3 or 4 or 5 different potential causes. They're probably all happening in some extent. It's hard to document, especially from the outside, how, like which of these are actually the dominant effect. And in that paper, in that first paper that I mentioned, like I would just recommend reading it if you actually care about the legal, sort of the legal status. And what they do is they go through sort of what all the different causes would mean for the legal liability under the current legal framework would mean for the legal liability of various players here, right? So in what sense is the advertiser who is like actually showing the ad or like wanting the ad to be shown, when are they legally liable, or when is Google as just like Google is just this intermediary, or they like to say they're just this marketplace maker that they're just connecting the advertiser and people to show the ad, and what's it like in what settings is that intermediary liable. And it turns out it's very often hard to make Google liable for any of this stuff. Okay, but laws and regulation are actively being written. At the very least, this stuff needs external audit capability. Like whenever you read these papers, or whenever I read these papers, I've just like come across impressed that they did it at all, just because like the hurdles to do this kind of research from like you'll often see, for example, I think just this year, Facebook shut down for at least a little bit one of the more prominent like outside journalists who like collect a bunch of ads to try to do this type of work, called the Ad Observer. And so you often see platforms trying to shut down this type of work or like otherwise creating pressure. And then that's also not counting like the institutional pressures, like getting this stuff through a university IRB. Like imagine trying to tell university IRB, I want to break the law and show employment ads. I want to see if Google will let me break the law, right? Like this stuff is like hard research to do, and like hard both in the institutional sense, but also like the technical sense, like finding clever ways around like Facebook and Google and all of these also throw up a bunch of technical roadblocks to understand what image is being like what an ad contains to a crawler. And I think if we actually had this discussion, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if we actually had this discussion in class, my guess is different ones of you like sort of there'd be a difference of opinion on which of like the causes we talked about are like sort of that Google or the advertiser or various other players in the space should be liable for, either legally or ethically in some vague sense. Any other thoughts or questions on the advertising? Do people have strong thoughts here that they want to share with the class? Okay, so then we'll switch to, we won't go in nearly as much detail for this one. I do want to leave some time to just answer project questions and so on at the end. Okay, so now we're going to jump to discrimination in online marketplaces. So think like Airbnb and Uber and so on. This is, I mean, the first paper I'm aware of in the online marketplace studying discrimination. I might have missed one. So this paper, Racial Discrimination in the Sharing Economy, Evidence from a Field Experiment, was about Airbnb. And they did what's a very classic study of discrimination. So, of course, documenting and studying discrimination in employment and housing and all of those contexts has a long history, going back to before the Civil Rights Act, right? And one of the most powerful techniques is essentially a resume test. It's what I've heard it called as a resume test, which is you send 2 resumes to a job agency or an employer that are otherwise identical, except they have different names. And the names seem to imply something about the race of the individual of the resume, of the fake individual who's behind this resume. And so it could be a quote unquote stereotypically white name or quote unquote a stereotypically black name, or Asian or what have you. And then you just see that what are the differential callback rates or higher rates. And what that would tell you is what the employer's perception of the race. So the resume doesn't explicitly have race colon something on the resume, but what the employer's perception of the race of the individual leads to sort of discrimination and even that first step of the process. So that's a very classic thing to do. Sort of that's led to many legal challenges and victories. And they essentially ran that for Airbnb, where they created fake user profiles, some with, and then some with stereotypically black names, some with stereotypically white names. And I think they also had images this time, so images on the profile. And then this was I think back in 2015 when hosts had a lot of power in deciding whether they could approve or it was very easy. So the default then was hosts would receive an application for a specific stay. They'd be able to read the application and then decide yes or no whether they want to approve the stay. So instant booking wasn't really a huge thing for those of you who use Airbnb. And what they found was, unfortunately, exactly what you might expect, is guests with distinctively black names receive positive responses 42% of the time compared to 50% for white guests. So there is an effect just by the name. And hosts lost $65 to $100 of revenue for each black guest that they rejected. And so hosts were sort of rejecting, even of course, to the detriment of the guest, of the potential guest, but also to their own financial detriment. And then this 2016 paper essentially did the same thing for Uber, I believe. So racial and gender discrimination in transportation network companies. And across all trips, the cancellation rate for African-American sounding names was more than twice as frequent compared to white sounding names. And so this is on these platforms. At the time, drivers couldn't see. So at the time, I think drivers could see the name and potentially the picture of the potential passenger before they picked them up. So after they approved the request, but before they picked them up. And in that time, sort of cancellation rate for African American names was twice as frequent compared to white sounding names. And this was like an experiment. So this isn't like correlational that you could think is like, oh, the driver saw where they were where they were picking it up and they didn't like certain locations over others. This was an experiment that sort of, again, they sent in these requests from different locations and they found this. They also found evidence that drivers took female passengers. So like after the pickup, drivers in Boston took female passengers for longer, more expensive rides. And so, they went like circuitous routes and so on. And so I think both of these papers, and now there's a host of papers documenting these type of things on various platforms. Unlike the online advertising sense, this is like very clear where this is coming from, right? Like in this case, discrimination is coming from the host or from the driver, right? It's the people involved in the other side who are discriminating potentially illegally. And so the question is, what can the platform do about this? And there's now a set of papers that have given different design mitigations, and platforms have invested some amount of time and effort in doing the obvious things to mitigate some of these disparities. And one sec, do I talk about this? Okay, yeah, I talk about this later. Okay, so in this paper, just last year, when transparency fails, bias and financial incentives in ride-sharing platforms, what they documented was in reaction to papers like the last one that I talked about in Uber, platforms reacted by in some sense reducing transparency, right? Hiding the name and the image of the actual passenger until the last possible moment of pickup. And they found, and so yeah, so platforms reduced operational transparency by removing the information about gender and race from the ride request. And they found that sort of bias at that stage was eliminated because drivers no longer have the information. However, they found that racial and LGBT biases were still present later on in the funnel. I think this was documenting a platform that sort of at request time, the information was removed, but still between the request and the pickup, you could still see that information. And so they documented that removing the information helped at that stage, but some of this was still persistent later on. And similarly, for those of you who used Airbnb recently or have been using it over the last 5-6 years, you might have seen an increased push toward what's called instant booking, right? So now if you go to Airbnb, for most of the time, you'll see that a lot of hosts have turned on instant booking, which you request it and then you immediately get approved. And this is even before the host can see any information. And then afterward, the host now sees your information, and then you can talk to them and so on. And I still think that then they have the power to cancel, but they don't they don't have the power to just reject you if they've turned on instant booking. And Airbnb pushed that to hosts and partially removed guest and profile names from the host portal in reaction to these papers that documented discrimination, right? So, and this might seem like a small change, but it actually sort of, at least they're claiming it had a big impact in reducing discrimination. And in some sense, it's very different from the starting culture of Airbnb, right? So the very initial advertising and marketing of Airbnb was there's a relationship between the host and the guest. It's social and it's not just a hotel place to stay, but it's supposed to be social and you should be able to vet or not just vet, but also prioritize people that you're going to be more social with and so on. And this push to instant booking was, in some sense, a recognition that that wasn't Airbnb anymore. That, yeah. Yeah, great question. It's like you read my next slide. So the question is like what role do ratings play in all of this? Sort of, can you use ratings to mitigate some of these biases, or maybe they exacerbate them and so on? And okay, so that's this next paper. Okay, so one design mitigation that is in this paper, and then like what Airbnb actually pushed, it just hide information, right? Like hide and like sort of what's causing the discrimination is like the host and the driver's perception of the race of the person on the other side, just hide until as late in the process as possible that information. And like that, to some extent, that works. This next paper, I think, is really nice, and that it also shows that ratings help quite a bit on these platforms. So this is on Airbnb. I think it got published last year, but I think it's been around for a few years now. Discrimination with incomplete information in the sharing economy, evidence from field experiments on Airbnb. And Dennis was kind enough to share his images with me from his slides. Or he shared his slides, but then I took the images. And so in their first study, they again ran and like sort of very similar resume tests like that first paper on Airbnb did. And so their first experiment was a replication of that paper. And they found that even when they did it, I don't remember when this experiment was run, I think in 2018, around 2017, 2018. So like a few years after the original paper. They found that there were still differences in acceptance rates. So in this particular market, for example, there was a 20 percentage points difference, almost 50% absolute or relative in acceptance rates for guests with no review information. So if neither the white person nor the Black person has a review, the acceptance rate was about 28.7% versus 47.8%. But then they found that even one positive review, or even a negative review, actually completely closes the gap. So they found that if you took the same exact profile and gave them one review, and this was of course a fake review, like they also created host accounts that would review their fake guest accounts and so on, and so there was like a controlled study, and so they found that if this fake guest account had even one review, that would that increased acceptance rates for both white and Black guests, but it increased them so much for Black guests to completely close the gap on Airbnb, at least at the time. So this, at least, if this and they found that basically the same thing generalizes across Airbnb, across different markets. And at least if this generalizes over time into other marketplaces and so on, this seems like good news that providing even a negative review would close the gap. Okay. Any other questions on? And so I think that's all I had for the discrimination section. I think we have about 10 minutes left. So first, maybe questions on the content for today, and then we can transition to questions about the rest of the course, project, so on. Was Facebook, so the question is, was Facebook aware that they were doing those experiments? I think let's see, I don't want to speak out of, so I mean, I think at the beginning they were not, but then, at some point a paper came out, and I think then Facebook blocked their advertiser account. Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, no. And I think that's part of the reason, like sort of, and I think this has been an increasing focus of um, sort of, we'll see how much of this actually happens and so on. But um, that's been like like extreme, like sort of increasing idea in the air or like push by, like the new sort of, there's now like a powerhouse of like algorithmic bias and fairness researchers who work for the Biden administration across like the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, for the FTC and a few others. And like they're just like, yeah, they're hiring a lot of like sort of algorithmic fairness and bias people. And this has been one of their pushes, I think, is to try to create standard, or hopefully this would happen. We'll see. But like I think it's important to have these like external audit like capabilities, because if like this type of research is like incredibly like, it is violating terms and services, right? It's often, this type of research is often violating terms and services, and many university IRBs blanket say that you're not allowed to violate terms and services. And so many university IRBs might not even let you like do this type of research. And then there's like the technical hurdles and like, if they just kick you off and so on. Yeah, yeah. So the question is, yeah, like, is there a reason why, like, given a negative review, does it? Yeah, I mean, the author, like, like the authors, I think they write like a math. You often have to like publish in like management, like operations management science journals, because I think they come up with like some math model to try to explain. Like, I think what they try to capture is like, or at least this is my interpretation, which is like there's some like belief that the host might have had about, about the guests, and even a negative review is like better than the belief they had. Yeah, but I think they avoid, and certainly I would like to avoid, to like mind read a little too much. Any other questions here? Okay, so I'm going to put the announcements up again. Happy to take questions about the class project and so on. I know I've been sending, I think now as of the Tuesday, I've sent like 4 long announcements on EdSTEM. I think so I know there's a lot, so happy to simplify and take questions. Yes, I would think about 2 things. So like I would do the 2 things separately. So the first one I would try to validate is is like the demand estimation. And so there you can look at like, there just like a prediction task, and so you can just validate that like you do any prediction task, like cross validation and so on. And like the comparison of expected revenue versus actual revenue would help you there. The other one, to validate like the price, like the actual optimization of the prices, what I would do there is like sort of you can like I mean offline, but like not like online when you submit the code, but offline you have all the time in the world, right? Like you can like for like 100 samples, you can like brute force the optimal price by just like doing a very fine grid and just start like calculating all of them and finding the optimal price. And so if you brute force finding the optimal price, then you can compare your sort of your more efficient code that like either samples like like subsamples 100 prices or like does the iterative refinement or does like the zero like the various approaches I said. You can like test how good those approaches are and finding like the optimal price that your brute force set. So that's how it would test the price sort of that setting. Um, so let me paraphrase the question if I understood it. So like there's, I mean, certainly going to be scenarios where the customer buys neither item. And then you're saying that's like potentially bad. And how do I avoid that? I mean, I wouldn't say it's like necessarily bad, right? Like sometimes you do like want to like you do want the customer like if I just think about one item, I'm selling a luxury good, and like some people are just not going to buy the luxury good if I sell it at $1,000, right? But that's still my revenue maximizing price. Like if I want to maximize the number of people who bought the item, I would set the price to zero, but that wouldn't maximize my overall revenue. So like I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that sometimes the customer buys neither item. Yeah, I mean, sort of like actually let me so like in like ex post it's bad, right? So like if you like could read the customer's mind and knew exactly how much they value the item, and you could do that for each customer, then yes, like sort of your optimal prices would set the price at exactly their valuation, and you would do that differently for each customer. And so like in like if you were perfectly omniscient, it's bad that sometimes someone doesn't buy an item, but you're not perfectly omniscient, or potentially you can't personalize prices for each individual. And in those settings, it's like not necessarily a bad thing that not everyone can buy something. For the customer, what's the logic on their end? Like how they determine buy product one or product two? Do they have like a price that you set, and then if we're below that, it buys it? Yeah. So the question is like, what's called the choice model for the customer? Like, how are they deciding whether to buy neither item, one or two, or then which two people to buy it from? So that's actually exists. So I think in during the pricing module, I had a few slides about pricing multiple items, and then I gave sort of a choice model there for the customer, where sort of they have an internal valuation for each item. They subtract the price from their valuation, and then they take if either of if they'll take they'll buy the item with the maximum evaluation minus price if that number is over zero. If that number is less than zero for both, then they buy neither item. So in a competition, if our competitor has a product that's lower value than one price, even if we're below it, the customer will buy the other item. Yes. So in some sense, so now with competition, another way you can think about it is for each item. So for item one and item two, the customer is only going to consider buying the cheaper of the two prices from you or the customer, or from you or your opponent. But now you have two prices, one for each item, which is the min over you and the opponent. And then the buyer then sends that through the choice model that I just said, which it looks at those prices, it subtracts the prices from the valuations and then buys the one that maximizes valuation minus price. Yes and no. So the question is, can you just aggressively undercut to win the competition? So I think I say this either in the strategy document or the instructions document, which is we're not doing, so at first I thought we would do like a playoffs tournament or something, but then I realized it was susceptible to that. So we're just doing a round robin where everyone's going to compete against everyone else once. And the team with the sort of the ranking is going to be like overall revenue across all the games. And so if you're undercutting in every game, then in every game in which you're playing, your revenue is going to be like close to zero. And you might win each of the games that you're playing in, but those people are also going to play other teams. And in those things, they might have very high revenue because other people aren't doing the undercutting. And so my guess is you're unlikely to win. Like you might win every individual game that you play, but you're unlikely to win the competition. Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah, so sort of the big ones is come to office hours today, Wednesday, Friday, and only if these are well attended will we create office hours on Sunday. And then I think you can, I posted instructions for how to submit your code. We can start sort of, I think someone gave this feedback for the last part is like sort of some like leaderboard stuff before the final. And so if you submit by Wednesday, we'll do one round of the tournament on Thursday. If you submit by Friday, we'll do another round on Saturday. And then the final submission will be Sunday. With that, I'll let you go. Oh, it's late anyway.